The afternoon sun bled through a haze of ochre dust, coating the raw timber of Deadwood's storefronts and settling like a shroud on the shoulders of every man who dared to dream of gold. The town, a raw gash carved into the ancient quiet of the Black Hills, stank of sweat-crude whiskey and the metallic tang of ambition. Progress was coming in the form of a half-built railroad office, its skeletal frame a monument to the greed that fueled this place. It was here, in the shadow of this unfinished promise, that a transaction of a far older kind was taking place. Wayne Boone stood across the thoroughfare, his presence as unobtrusive as a weathered stone. He had come to town for salt and flour, a rare journey from the high mountain clearing that was his only sanctuary. He moved with the economy of a man who'd learned that noise was a liability in the wild. His worn buckskins and the quiet gravity in his gaze setting him apart from the boisterous prospectors. He was about to turn back toward the general store when the commotion snared his attention. Bartholomew Turner, a man whose face was a roadmap of sour disappointments, was half dragging, half shoving a young woman toward the steps of the railroad office. Assisting him was his son Clive, a brutish copy of his father, his grip tight on the woman's other arm. She fought them not with screams, but with a stiff-spined, desperate silence, her boots scuffing uselessly in the thick dust. "It is a signed contract, Mr. Kane." Bartholomew wheezed his voice, straining with a mix of deference and desperation. "A debt is a debt." Waiting for them on the porch was Silas Kane. He was a stark contrast to the grime of Deadwood. Dressed in a tailored black coat, his silver hair impeccably combed, he watched the scene with an air of bored amusement. Kane was more than a landowner. He was an architect of the territory's future, buying up claims, controlling water rights, and weaving a web of influence that held the town captive. He held a rolled document in his gloved hand, tapping it lightly against his thigh. Indeed, Mr. Turner Kane's voice was smooth-cultured and carried easily over the jeers of the assembling crowd. And the collateral is quite clear. One daughter Abigail to be wedded to me, thereby nullifying your outstanding financial obligations. The woman Abigail finally broke her silence. "I am not collateral." Her voice was raw but clear, cutting through the murmurs. She twisted violently, and for a moment she was free. As she stumbled back, the collar of her worn dress shifted, and Wayne's world stopped. Around her neck, catching the dusty sunlight, was a small silver locket, oval-shaped with a delicate floral etching. His breath caught in his throat. It was impossible. It was a perfect match to the one he had carved for his late wife Lila a lifetime ago. The one she was wearing when he laid her in the ground. The sight was a physical blow, a ghost's touch across the chasm of years. His hands, which had been resting loosely at his sides, clenched into fists. This was no longer a stranger's misfortune. This was a desecration of a memory he had buried so deep it had become part of his bones. Abigail's brief freedom was over. Clive grabbed her again, his fingers digging into her arm. "Get a hold of yourself, Abby. You're bringing shame on us." "Shame," she cried, her eyes flashing with a fire that seemed to defy her hopeless situation. "You are selling me like a mule?" Kane smiled, a thin, predatory curve of his lips. "A figure of speech, my dear. Think of it as a merger. Your family's unfortunate circumstances and my generosity." He unfurled the document. "Now shall we have the justice of the peace make it official?" Wayne moved. He didn't run. He walked his steps steady and deliberate, parting the crowd of onlookers like a ship's prow through water. The jeers and whispers died as he approached his shadow falling over the tense scene. He stopped before Bartholomew, his gaze fixed not on the father or the son, but on Silas Kane. "A debt is a debt," Wayne said, his voice low and raspy from disuse, yet carrying the weight of the mountains he called home. He unslung the heavy leather satchel from his shoulder, the product of a long winter's trapping, and dropped it onto the dusty ground between them. It landed with a heavy final thud. "I'll pay it." Silence. Thick and absolute. Bartholomew stared, his mouth agape. Clive looked from the bag of furs to Wayne, his brutish confidence faltering. Silas Kane's amused expression tightened into a mask of cold fury. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, narrowed on Wayne. He recognized him. It was a flicker of recognition. But it was there, a dark ancient ledger being opened in the back of his mind. "You," Kane said, the single word dripping with contempt. "The hermit of Shadow Creek, what possible interest could you have in this?" Wayne's gaze dropped to the locket still resting against Abigail's collarbone. His motive was a raw, aching wound. He couldn't explain a question he had to answer. He looked back at Kane, his own eyes holding a history just as deep and unforgiving. "That's my business," Wayne stated. He then turned his attention to Abigail, who was staring at him, her defiant eyes now wide with shock and confusion. For the first time, he spoke directly to her, his voice softer than anyone in Deadwood had ever heard it. "The choice is yours. You can stay or you can leave with me, but you won't be sold." The offer hung in the dusty air, a lifeline thrown into a maelstrom. For Wayne, it was an impulsive, cataclysmic act, driven by a ghost. For Abigail, it was the first choice she had ever been given. And for Silas Kane, it was an unforeseen obstacle, an old wound pricked by a man he thought history had already forgotten. The quiet mountain man had just declared war on the most powerful man in the territory, all for a memory locked in a silver oval. The air in Deadwood crackled with a tension thicker than the dust. Silas Kane's composure was a veneer of ice over a boiling rage. He studied Wayne Boone not as a rival, but as an artifact unearthed from a past he had worked diligently to bury. The whispers among the townsfolk confirmed it. This was the recluse from the high peaks, a man spoken of, in rumors a specter from the fever year that had scoured the valley a decade ago. "This is a private matter," Kane said, his voice a silken threat. "A legal agreement between myself and the Turner family. It stopped being private when you made it a public spectacle." Wayne countered his stance, unyielding. He nudged the heavy satchel of furs with his boot. "There are prime beaver and mink pelts in that bag. More than enough to cover a Turner's debt and then some. Take it and consider the account settled." Bartholomew's greedy eyes darted to the bag, but a single sharp glance from Kane froze him. "This isn't about money," Kane said, his focus locked on Wayne. "It's about honoring an arrangement. An arrangement made under duress is no arrangement at all," Wayne said. He then looked past them all to the young woman held between her father and brother. "Miss Turner," he said, his voice steady, "I have a claim up in the mountains. It's quiet and it's solitary. But it's free. If you come with me, you'll owe me nothing. You'll be your own person on your own land." Abigail stared, her mind reeling. This man, a stranger, who looked as wild as the mountains he described, was offering her an escape she had never dared to imagine. She looked at her father's desperate face, her brother's contempt, and Silas Kane's cold proprietary smile. She saw her future laid out before her, a gilded cage, a life of silent servitude to a man who saw her as a chess piece. Then she looked at the mountain man, at the profound stillness in his eyes, and saw not a promise of comfort, but a chance at dignity. Her decision was made in the straightening of her spine. "I'll go with him." The words were quiet, but they landed like a hammer blow. Bartholomew sputtered, "Abigail, you will do as you're told." But before he could tighten his grip, Wayne stepped forward. He didn't draw a weapon or raise his voice. He simply moved into their space, a physical embodiment of resolution, and gently but firmly took Abigail's arm, pulling her away from her family's grasp. Clive lunged, but Wayne turned his free hand, shooting out to catch Clive's wrist in a grip of iron. Clive winced, his bravado crumbling into pain. "The lady has made her choice," Wayne said, his voice flat and final. He released Clive, who stumbled back, clutching his arm. Kane watched, his face unreadable, but a dangerous light danced in his eyes. "You are making a grave mistake, Boone. The Black Hills have a long memory. It remembers those who build and those who bring ruin. You should know that better than anyone." The veiled threat, a clear reference to their shared unspoken past, hung in the air. Wayne's jaw tightened, but he didn't reply. He knew Kane wasn't just talking about land. He was talking about the cholera, about the settlement that had died, about Lila. Without another word, Wayne turned, and with a hand lightly on Abigail's back to guide her, began to walk away. He didn't look back at the satchel of furs, at the furious land baron, or at the family that had just disowned their daughter. He led her toward the livery stable, the stunned silence of the crowd following them. As they walked, the old town doctor, Doc Mallory, who had seen more than his share of Deadwood's tragedies, muttered to the man beside him, "Wayne Boone. Haven't seen that look in his eyes since the fever year. Something wicked has been stirred up today." Abigail followed Wayne, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. He procured a sturdy pack mule without haggling, his movements efficient and sure. He loaded it with the supplies he'd come for: salt, flour beans, and a new axe head, before turning to her. "Can you ride?" he asked. She nodded, though her experience was limited to the stubborn plow horse on her father's failed farm. He helped her onto the mule's back, his touch brief and impersonal. She watched him, trying to decipher the man who had just upended her life. His face was a mask of stoic calm, but she saw the tension in his shoulders and the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings. He wasn't just rescuing her. He was running from something that had just reappeared on a Deadwood porch. As they left the last dusty outpost of the town behind the trail, began to climb into the pine-scented air of the Black Hills, the cacophony of Deadwood faded, replaced by the whisper of wind through the trees and the steady plod of hooves. The silence between them was vast and intimidating. Hours passed. Abigail's fear began to curdle into a new kind of anxiety. Who was this man? What did he truly want from her? When the sun was high overhead, Wayne called a halt by a clear, fast-running stream. He offered her water from a tin cup before drinking himself. His movements were patient, deliberate. He never stared, never encroached on her space. Finally, she found her voice. Why, she asked the word, barely a whisper. "Why did you do that?" Wayne finished his drink and wiped his mouth on the back of his hand. He looked not at her, but at the stream, as if the water held the answer. "I saw something that needed doing," he said, his answer frustratingly simple. "You made an enemy of Silas Kane," she pressed. "No one does that. He owns half the territory." "Some things are more important than land," he replied, his gaze distant. She gathered her courage. The locket, she said, her hand instinctively going to the silver oval at her throat. "Is that why? Did you recognize it?" Wayne's stoic facade finally cracked. He turned to face her, and for the first time, she saw the profound, bottomless grief in his eyes. It was an old, well-worn sorrow, and it shook her to her core. "It belonged to my wife," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I buried it with her 10 years ago." Abigail's blood ran cold. She fumbled with the clasp, her fingers trembling as she opened the locket. Inside there was no portrait, only a tiny, intricately folded piece of paper. She had never opened it, honoring the one thing her mother had given her with the instruction to keep it safe and never look inside until she was truly alone. My mother gave it to me on her deathbed, she explained, her voice shaking. She said it was a family heirloom to keep me safe. Wayne stared at the empty space where a portrait should have been his expression, a mixture of confusion and pain. The mystery deepened. He had intervened to protect a memory, only to find himself entangled in a riddle. His past was not only haunting him, it was walking beside him, wearing his dead wife's locket, and looking at him with the eyes of a stranger. The journey to his clearing was no longer just an escape. It was a pilgrimage into the heart of a tragedy he thought he had long since outrun. The trail narrowed, winding deeper into the granite heart of the mountains. For 2 days they traveled in a charged silence, the revelation about the locket hanging between them like an unspoken question. Wayne led his pace steady, while Abigail followed on the mule, her mind a whirlwind of confusion. Her mother, a quiet, gentle woman, had never spoken of a past beyond their small, failing farm. How could she have possessed the locket of a mountain man's dead wife? Just as the sun began its descent on the second day, they crested a ridge. Below them, nestled in a small, verdant basin, was Wayne's claim. It wasn't a cabin, not yet. It was the skeleton of a home, 4 sturdy walls of notched pine logs, rising to waist height, surrounding a cleared patch of earth and a carefully constructed stone hearth. Beside it stood a primitive lean-to, and tools were stacked with meticulous order against a massive stump. The air was clean-scented with pine and damp earth, and the only sound was the distant call of a hawk circling high above. It was a place of profound solitude, a testament to a long and lonely labor. "This is it." Wayne said, his voice softer here, as if he were speaking in a church. He began to unload the mule, his movements economical. Abigail slid off the mule's back, her legs stiff. She looked at the half-built structure, at the immense wilderness stretching out in every direction. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. "You're building this alone." "Had nothing but time," he answered without looking up. He gestured toward the lean-to. It's dry. You can sleep there. I'll take the ground by the fire." That night, as a blanket of stars emerged in the ink-black sky, they shared a meal of beans and jerky. The quiet was different here. In Deadwood, silence was a pause between violences. Here it was the world's natural state. "Tomorrow we work," Wayne said, staring into the fire. "A house doesn't build itself. You can help or you can rest. The choice is yours." "I'll help," she said immediately. "I'm not afraid of work." He gave a slight nod, a flicker of approval in his eyes. He expected her to be fragile, a town girl broken by circumstance. But he saw the same defiant spark in her that he'd seen on the porch in Deadwood. The next morning, the real work began. Wayne was a patient, if silent, teacher. He showed her how to mix clay and moss to chink the gaps between the logs, how to use a draw knife to peel bark, how to brace the timber while he hammered pegs into place. Her hands, soft from a life of mending and cooking, were soon raw and blistered. Her muscles screamed in protest. But she never complained. She watched him, learned from him, and slowly the rhythm of the work became a language between them. They were not just building a cabin. They were building a fragile, unspoken trust. The first sign of trouble arrived a week later. They awoke one morning to find the small spring they used for water fouled with the bloated carcass of a dead coyote, its entrails deliberately spilled into the pool. It was no accident. The animal had been shot and dragged there. Wayne's face hardened as he stared at the scene. "Kane?" He said the name. A low growl. "He's sending a message." Abigail's stomach turned. "What do we do?" "We find another source." He said calmly, though a muscle twitched in his jaw. and we become more careful. They spent the day hauling water from a creek a half-mile down the mountain, a back-breaking task. That night, Wayne didn't sleep by the fire. He took his rifle and melted into the shadows, at the edge of the clearing, a silent guardian against the darkness. A few days later, a second message came. They were raising a heavy roof beam when the ground shuddered. A cascade of rocks and dirt thundered down the slope just above them, crashing through the trees and landing precisely where their woodpile had been stacked. It was a rock slide, but a man-made one. They could hear the faint echo of men's laughter carried on the wind. Wayne shoved Abigail behind the safety of the cabin walls, his body shielding her. They listened as the echoes faded, leaving only the ringing in their ears. "They're trying to scare us off," she said, her voice trembling. "They're testing us," Wayne corrected, his eyes scanning the ridge where the slide had originated. "Kane wants to see if we'll break." But they didn't break. They cleared the rocks, salvaged what timber they could, and continued their work. The constant threat, however, forced them closer. They began to rely on each other, not just for labor, but for survival. She learned to read the signs of the forest, and he began to speak more, sharing small bits of knowledge about tracking, about weather, about the land. During these shared moments of work and watchfulness, Abigail's thoughts kept returning to the locket. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she finally unfolded the tiny brittle piece of paper from inside it. The handwriting was her mother's, elegant but faded. It wasn't a letter, but a list of names and dates under a heading. Valle Crucis Settlement Cholera Victims, 1866. Her breath hitched. She read the names aloud. Elias and Martha Kane, Anna Kane. Wayne, who had been sharpening a knife, went utterly still. He looked up, his face a pale, haunted mask in the firelight. "Valle Crucis," he whispered. "The settlement that was wiped out. The one by the river." "You know it?" she asked. "I lived there," he said, his voice hollow. "I was the carpenter. Lila, my wife, she died there." He looked at the paper in her hand. Silas Kane's parents, and his younger sister. The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture of horrifying clarity. Kane's obsession wasn't just about a broken contract. His animosity toward Wayne was rooted in a decade-old tragedy. And somehow, her mother and this locket were tied to the heart of it all. "My mother was a midwife," Abigail said, her mind racing. "She used to travel helping families. Maybe she was there during the fever." The fire crackled, the sound unnaturally loud, in the sudden tense silence. They were no longer just a man and a woman, building a shelter against the wilderness. They were two people bound by a shared history of loss, stalked by a man whose grief had festered into a terrible, patient vengeance. The cabin walls around them suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like the center of a gathering storm. The first snows of autumn dusted the high peaks, a stark warning of the approaching winter. The cabin was nearly complete, a sturdy fortress of pine and stone with a roof that no longer leaked and a door that could be barred against the wind and other more human threats. The shared labor and constant vigilance had forged a bond between Wayne and Abigail, a quiet partnership born of necessity and mutual respect. Abigail's investigation into the past became a quiet obsession. On a rare trip to Deadwood for supplies, a journey made with extreme caution, she sought out Doc Mallory. Feigning an interest in local history, she asked about the Valle Crucis settlement. The old doctor's face clouded over. A sad chapter, that one, he sighed, polishing his spectacles. The fever year came on fast. Cholera took almost everyone. Started at the well, they said. Contaminated water. He paused, his gaze turning inward. Hit the Kane family hardest. Lost the parents and the little girl. Silas was away at the time buying cattle. Came back to find his whole world gone. Never recovered, not really. He holds a grudge against that valley. Against everyone who was there. Was there a carpenter in the settlement? Abigail asked, her heart pounding. Aye, a good one. Fella named Boone. Lost his own wife and son in the outbreak. A terrible business. He built that well, you know. With the best of intentions, of course, but, well, blame has a way of sticking whether it's deserved or not. Silas Kane always believed Boone was responsible. The truth landed with the force of a physical blow. Kane's vendetta wasn't about land or a broken deal. It was about revenge. He blamed Wayne for the death of his entire family. Armed with this terrifying knowledge, Abigail returned to the mountain. She found Wayne splitting the last of the winter logs, the rhythmic thud of the axe the only sound in the clearing. She told him what she had learned. He listened without interruption, his face impassive, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the axe handle. I know, he said when she finished, his voice heavy. I've seen the way he looks at me. I always knew he blamed me. He sank onto a stump, the axe resting by his side. I built that well, dug it deep, lined it with stone. Thought it was the best water for miles. When the sickness started, I couldn't understand. Lila, our boy, they drank from it every day. His voice broke. I've lived with that guilt for 10 years, wondering if he was right. The weight of his confession settled over the clearing. Abigail sat beside him, the cold of the afternoon forgotten. It wasn't your fault, Wayne. It was a disease. No one knew. He shook his head, lost in the ghost-haunted corridors of his memory. It doesn't matter what's true. It only matters what a man believes. Their fragile peace was shattered a week later. The territorial marshal, a portly man named Abernathy, with a drooping mustache and an air of perpetual weariness, rode into their clearing, accompanied by 2 of Kane's hired guns, now deputized for the occasion. Wayne Boone, Abernathy said, dismounting heavily, I have a legal notice for you. He handed over a thick document bearing an official seal. Wayne read it, his expression hardening. It was a formal claim on his land. Silas Kane, using a loophole related to the abandonment of the Valle Crucis settlement, was claiming title to the entire basin, arguing that Wayne's squatters' rights were invalid because the land was part of a prior unresolved estate, the Kane estate. The claim was meticulously researched, legally sound, and utterly devastating. His goal was not just to run Wayne off. It was to take the very ground beneath his feet, the sanctuary he had built from his grief. This is my land, Wayne said, his voice a low rumble. I filed my claim 7 years ago. A claim Kane is now challenging in circuit court, Abernathy said with a shrug. It's a legal matter now. He's also filed an injunction. You're to vacate the premises pending the judge's ruling. And if I don't? Abernathy gestured to the deputized thugs. Then I'll be forced to remove you. Abigail stepped forward, her eyes blazing. You can't just throw us out. This is our home. She clutched the locket at her throat, a defiant gesture. This land has nothing to do with the Kanes. It was then that one of the deputies, a man with a cruel sneer, noticed the locket. Well, look at that. That's a Kane heirloom. I'd know that flower etching anywhere. The old man had one just like it. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Abigail stared at him, then at the locket in her hand. A family heirloom. Her mother had told the truth. But it wasn't her family. It was Lila's. It was Kane's. The realization dawned on her, as horrifying as it was absolute. Lila Boone Wayne's late wife had to have been a Kane. Silas Kane's sister. An estranged sister, perhaps one who had left her family behind, but a sister nonetheless. This wasn't a conflict between strangers. It was a tragic, twisted feud between two brothers-in-law, torn apart by a grief so profound that it had blinded them to their own kinship. Wayne had no idea. And Cain, in his all-consuming quest for revenge, was hunting the husband of the very sister he was trying to avenge. The threat was no longer just physical intimidation. It was total annihilation, a legal and emotional siege designed to erase Wayne from the landscape entirely. And Abigail, wearing the proof of their shared tragedy around her neck, was standing at the epicenter of it all. The injunction gave them 2 weeks to vacate. 2 weeks until Silas Cain could legally claim their home, their land, everything they had built. The days grew shorter, colder. A tense, grim silence settled over the cabin as Wayne fortified their position, barring the windows and reinforcing the door. He was not a man who would be driven from his home without a fight. But Cain was too cunning for a direct assault. He chose to attack Wayne's name instead. A few days after the marshal's visit, word reached them via a sympathetic trapper that Wayne had been accused of cattle rustling. 3 head of prize longhorns belonging to a neighboring rancher, a man deeply in debt to Cain, had gone missing, and a set of tracks suspiciously similar to those made by Wayne's boots had been found leading from the ranch toward the mountains. "He's turning the whole territory against you," Abigail said, pacing the small cabin floor. "By the time the judge hears the land claim, he'll have already painted you as a thief and an outlaw." Wayne stood by the window, staring out at the gray, unforgiving sky. He knew Cain's strategy. He was being isolated, choked off from any potential allies, his reputation being methodically dismantled until he had nowhere left to turn. "He's leaving me no choice but to fight," Wayne said, his voice grim. "And that's what he wants. He wants me to become the animal he thinks I am." Abigail stopped her pacing. She saw the despair in his eyes, the slow surrender to a fate Cain was scripting for him. And in that moment, she knew she could not let it happen. She would not be a bystander in this story. "No," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound strength. "We're not going to play his game. We're going to fight him with the truth." She walked to the rough-hewn table and unrolled an old map of the territory. "The rancher who accused you, where is his spread?" Wayne pointed to a spot miles to the south near the plains. "John Callan, a decent man, but weak. Cain holds his mortgage." "And where is the nearest army outpost?" "Fort Laramie, a 3-day ride if the weather holds." A plan began to form in her mind, desperate but necessary. "The Army keeps meticulous records, don't they? Records of settlements, land surveys, family registries for the territory. They might have something about Valle Crucis, something that proves Lila wasn't living with her family when she married you. Something that proves she chose to leave them." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with determination. "And I'll wager those stolen cattle aren't missing at all. They're probably hidden in a box canyon somewhere on Callan's own land. If I can find them, I can clear your name." Wayne stared at her, a mixture of awe and terror on his face. "Abby, no. It's too dangerous. The trail to Laramie is treacherous, and Cain's men will be watching the roads." "And what's the alternative?" She countered, her voice rising. "To sit here and wait for him to destroy you? To let him win?" She placed her hands on his shoulders, forcing him to meet her gaze. "You built me a home, Wayne. You gave me a choice when I had none. Now let me fight for it. Let me fight for us." He saw the woman she had become, no longer the timid, bartered girl from Deadwood, but a person of formidable will and courage. To deny her, this would be to deny the very strength he had come to admire most. He relented with a slow, heavy nod. "The cattle will be your priority. Proving I'm not a thief is more urgent than digging up the past." Callan has a weakness for the north pasture. It's remote. Check there first. They planned her departure for the dead of night. She would take the mule traveling light, sticking to the old game trails rather than the main roads. Wayne gave her his best hunting knife and a small single-shot pistol, showing her how to load and fire it until her hands were steady. As she prepared to leave bundled in a heavy cloak, he pressed a small hand-carved wooden bird into her palm. "So you remember the way back," he said, his voice rough with emotion. She clutched it tightly, her heart aching at the thought of leaving him alone to face whatever Cain might do next. "I'll be back before the first big snow," she promised. "Hold on until then." He pulled her into a fierce, desperate embrace, his arms a circle of warmth against the biting wind. "You are stronger than this whole mountain, Abigail Turner," he whispered against her hair. She rode out under the light of a slivered moon, the fate of their future resting on her shoulders. She was no longer just fighting for her own freedom, but for the life of the quiet, wounded man who had shown her what it meant to be truly free. The trail ahead was fraught with peril, but for the first time in her life, Abigail rode not away from something, but toward it. The wind began to howl in the late afternoon, a low, mournful cry that promised a storm. It came from the west, a roiling wall of black and brown dust that swallowed the horizon and bled the color from the sky. Wayne stood on the cabin porch, watching it come, a rifle resting in the crook of his arm. Abigail had been gone for 5 days. His gut told him two things with chilling certainty: she was in trouble, and so was he. He had just finished securing the last shutter when he saw them, 3 riders emerging from the trees at the edge of the clearing, and their forms distorted by the swirling dust. It was Silas Cain and 2 of his most ruthless men. They rode with an unnerving calm, as if the approaching tempest were an ally they had summoned themselves. Wayne stepped back inside, barred the heavy door, and moved to the window. The world outside was dimming the air, growing thick with grit. The wind shrieked, tearing at the cabin's new roof. This was it, the final confrontation. Boone Kane's voice cut through the gale, impossibly clear. "Come out and face your judgment. There is nowhere left for you to hide." "My judgment is my own to make," Cain, Wayne yelled back, his voice swallowed by the wind. A shot rang out, splintering the wood of the window frame next to his head. He ducked back, his heart pounding. The fight had begun. The dust storm descended in full fury, plunging the clearing into a chaotic twilight. Visibility dropped to near zero. The wind screamed like a banshee, and the cabin groaned under the assault. Through the maelstrom, Wayne saw shadows moving, circling the cabin. He fired a shot toward one of them, rewarded by a grunt of pain. They were using the storm as cover, trying to breach his defenses. Another shot shattered the small window pane, and he felt the sting of glass on his cheek. He was pinned down, one man against 3, in a world that was falling apart around him. He scrambled for cover behind the heavy oak table as bullets tore through the cabin walls. He was a hunter, a survivor. But this was a battle he knew he couldn't win. Cain's hatred was as relentless as the storm itself. Suddenly, a section of the back wall, weakened by the gunfire and battered by the wind, collapsed inward with a deafening crash. Dust, debris, and a howling gale flooded the small room. Through the new opening, one of Cain's men lunged, a knife flashing in the dim light. Wayne met him head-on, the 2 men grappling in the swirling chaos. He managed to bring his rifle butt up hard under the man's chin, sending him staggering back into the storm. He turned just in time to see Silas Cain stepping through the breach, a pistol in his hand, his tailored coat now ripped and filthy. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "It ends today." Boone Cain snarled, his voice raw. "Just like it should have ended 10 years ago. You built that well. You poisoned the water. You murdered my family." "It was the cholera," Wayne yelled, circling the hearth, keeping the fire between them. a sickness. A sickness you brought. Cain fired the shot, going wide as a gust of wind shook the entire structure. You took my parents. You took my little sister Anna. And you took Lila. Wayne froze. What did you say? Cain laughed, a terrible broken sound. You didn't know, did you? The fool carpenter, so blinded by his own grief, he never even asked about his own wife's family. He reached inside his tattered coat and pulled out a silver locket, identical to Wayne's, identical to Abigail's. He snapped it open. Even in the gloom, Wayne could see the tiny hand-painted portrait inside. It was Lila. Younger, but unmistakably her. My sister Cain spat the words, dripping with a decade of venom. Lila Cain. She ran off with you, a common laborer, disgracing our name. But she was still my sister, and you killed her. The revelation hit Wayne harder than any bullet. Brother-in-law. This entire bloody conflict was a family tragedy. He and the man trying to kill him were bound by the love of the same woman. His mind reeled, the storm inside him as violent as the one outside. Cain raised his pistol for the final shot. But at that moment, a new sound cut through the wind and the frantic braying of a mule. Through the dust, a figure appeared, stumbling toward the cabin. It was Abigail. She had returned. She saw the scene in the ruined cabin, Wayne and Cain locked in a deadly standoff, and screamed, "No!" Her voice broke the spell. Wayne lunged, not at Cain, but away from him, using the distraction to find cover. Abigail scrambled through the collapsed wall, her face streaked with dirt, her eyes wide with terror. "Stop it, both of you. Don't you see what this is?" She had ridden into the storm, risking everything to get back. She hadn't made it to Fort Laramie. She'd found the stolen cattle, just as Wayne predicted, hidden in a canyon, and had turned back, knowing the storm was a perfect cover for Cain's attack. Cain, momentarily stunned by her appearance, turned his furious gaze on her. "Get out of the way, girl. She was your sister," Abigail cried, her voice pleading as she looked at Wayne. Lila was his sister, Wayne. This isn't about a well, it's about grief. Wayne stared at Cain, the truth of her words echoing in the space between them. The face of his enemy was no longer just the face of a ruthless land baron. It was the face of his wife's brother, a man as shattered by loss as he was. The rage that had fueled him began to recede, replaced by a profound, aching sorrow. Cain, enraged by the interruption and the raw emotion of the moment, took aim at Wayne again. But Abigail moved. She threw herself between them, her arms outstretched. "No more," she screamed, her voice breaking. "If you kill him, you kill the last piece of her that's left. Don't let her memory be about this, please." Her plea, so raw and desperate, struck a chord in the deepest, most wounded part of both men. The storm howled the cabin, timbers groaned, and in the heart of the chaos, three people stood frozen, their shared past a devastating weight. Wayne had the chance to end it, to take his revenge on the man who had tormented him. But looking at Abigail, at the brave, defiant woman standing before him, he knew he couldn't. Killing Cain wouldn't bring Lila back. It would only make him a monster, sacrificing the peaceful man. He was becoming the man Abigail believed him to be, for a moment of vengeance. He lowered his rifle. The choice was made. He would not break the cycle. He would end it. The wind died down as suddenly as it had risen, leaving an eerie, dust-choked silence in its wake. The world was coated in a fine brown powder, the trees skeletal and gray. In the wreckage of the cabin, the three of them stood breathing heavily, the emotional storm still raging within them. Silas Cain stared at Abigail, his pistol wavering. Her words had pierced through his decade-long armor of hate. He looked at Wayne, who stood with his rifle lowered, not a killer, but a man steeped in a grief that mirrored his own. The fury in Cain's eyes began to crumble, replaced by a vast, empty confusion. His entire identity for the last 10 years had been built on this singular burning purpose to destroy the man who had ruined his life. Without it, he was nothing. The sound of approaching horses broke the stillness. A moment later, Marshal Abernathy and 2 armed men appeared at the edge of the clearing. One of them was John Callan, the rancher, his face a mask of shame. "It's over, Cain," Abernathy said, his voice grim. "Miss Turner found your stolen cattle right where she said they'd be." Callan confessed everything. "You're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder." Cain didn't resist. He seemed to shrink, the fight draining out of him, leaving only a hollow shell. He dropped the pistol to the floor. As the marshal cuffed his hands behind his back, his gaze fell on the locket Abigail still wore. "That was my mother's," he whispered, his voice cracking. "She gave one to each of her daughters, Lila and Anna." He looked at Wayne, a flicker of understanding, of shared loss passing between them for the first and last time. "You loved her." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a final tragic acknowledgement of their bond. Wayne simply knotted his throat too tight for words. As Abernathy led him away, Cain looked back one last time at the mountain, at the ruined cabin, at the 2 people standing in its doorway. He was no longer a powerful land baron, just a man broken by a past he could never escape. With the lawmen gone, a profound quiet descended. Wayne and Abigail stood amidst the debris of their home. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light, piercing the gloom. The air smelled of splintered pine and wet earth. Wayne walked over to the hearth and sank onto the stone ledge, burying his face in his hands. The revelations of the past hour washed over him in waves: Lila's secret, Cain's identity, the years of misplaced guilt and misunderstood grief. Abigail knelt beside him. She didn't speak, just placed a hand on his shoulder. After a long moment, he looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with a pain so deep it seemed ancient. "She never told me," he said, his voice a raw whisper. "Lila. She said she was an orphan, that she had no family. I never questioned it. I was just so happy to have her." "Maybe she wanted to be free," Abigail offered gently. "Free of a name, of a past. Maybe with you she could just be Lila." They talked for hours as they began the slow, arduous process of cleaning up the wreckage. They spoke of Lila, sharing memories from their 2 vastly different perspectives. Wayne spoke of her laughter, the way she loved the scent of sawdust, her dream of having children. Abigail spoke of the fragmented stories her mother had told of 2 sisters who were inseparable until one chose love over family duty. Together, they pieced together the portrait of a woman they had both loved, a woman whose choices had led them all to this broken place. They worked side by side, clearing debris, patching the hole in the wall, and their shared movements, a familiar, comforting rhythm. They were starting over, not just rebuilding a physical structure, but clearing the emotional wreckage of their lives. As the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a warm, golden light over the clearing, a sense of peace began to settle over them. The past had been confronted, the ghosts had been named. The battle was over. Now the healing could begin. 6 months later, the mountain was transformed. The cabin stood stronger than before, its new timbers weathered to a silver-gray smoke curling from its chimney in a steady, confident plume. The scars on the land from the rock slide were now covered with the green shoots of spring wildflowers. But beside the cabin stood something new, a small, one-room schoolhouse, its walls built from the same mountain pine, its windows large and clear to let in the morning light. Inside, Abigail stood before a half-dozen children, the sons and daughters of trappers and miners from the surrounding hills, guiding a young boy's hand as he shakily wrote his name on a piece of slate. Her voice was calm and patient, her smile easy. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a teacher, a builder of futures. Wayne sat on the schoolhouse steps, sanding a small wooden desk until it was perfectly smooth. He worked with a quiet contentment and the haunted look in his eyes replaced by a deep, steady calm. The sounds from the schoolhouse, the scrape of chalk, the murmur of children's voices, Abigail's gentle laughter were the melody of his new life. When the lessons were finished and the children had run off down the trail, their shouts echoing in the trees, Abigail came out and sat beside him. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and he wrapped an arm around her. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun dip toward the ridge. "It's finished," he said, nodding toward the schoolhouse. "It's a good, strong building." "It's more than a building," she said softly. "It's a promise." He reached into his pocket and pulled out two objects that glinted in the fading light, his silver locket and the one that had belonged to Cain, which the marshal had given to Abigail. They were tarnished, now heavy, with the weight of the past. Without a word, they walked to the corner of the schoolhouse where the cornerstone had been laid. Wayne knelt and worked the heavy stone free from the earth. He dug a small hole in the damp soil beneath it. Abigail took his locket, and he took hers. For a moment they held them, these small silver vessels of so much pain and love. Then together they placed them in the hole and covered them with earth. They were laying the ghosts of Lila, of Cain, of the fever year to rest. They were burying the past to make room for the future. Wayne eased the cornerstone back into place. It was solid, foundational. He stood and took Abigail's hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. They looked at the home they had built at the school that stood as a beacon of hope, and at the vast, peaceful wilderness that stretched out before them. They had found their peace, not by outrunning the past, but by facing it, understanding it, and finally forgiving it. Here on this quiet mountain, a woman once deemed useless, and a man once lost to grief had built more than a cabin. They had built a home, a community, and a life, born from the ashes of tragedy. The quiet that surrounded them was no longer one of loneliness, but of profound and lasting love.